He was the most powerful being on the battlefield. Every warrior on both sides knew it. Bhishma knew it, Drona knew it, Karna knew it. Duryodhan, who had spent years calculating every military advantage he could accumulate, knew it better than anyone, which is precisely why, when he came to Krishna before the war to ask for his armies, he counted it as his greatest victory when Arjuna chose Krishna himself instead. Because Duryodhan understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had built his entire life around strategic thinking, that the Narayani Sena, Krishna's personal army of 140,000 warriors, was the measurable prize. What he could not measure, and therefore could not adequately fear, was the alternative. The man who sat unarmed on Arjuna's chariot, holding the reins of 4 white horses, dressed in gold and yellow silk, with nothing in his hands and no weapons at his belt, that man was the actual danger. And for 18 days, the most catastrophically powerful being in the 3 worlds, sat on a chariot and drove it. He held his vow. He did not fight. And in not fighting, in choosing, deliberately and at enormous personal cost, to be the voice in Arjuna's ear rather than the arm at Arjuna's side, he changed the war in a way that no weapon in any arsenal has ever changed anything. This is the story of the most powerful choice ever made on a battlefield, the choice not to act. And by the time this story is finished, you will understand why that choice was not restrained. It was the most radical, the most dangerous, and the most complete expression of power that the Mahabharata tradition has ever recorded. I am your host, Guru Acharya, and I welcome you all to this exciting new episode of the channel, The Eternal Odyssey, where we explore the stories of myths and fantasies. Chapter 1: The vow that redrew the war before it began. The decision not to fight was not made on the first day of Kurukshetra. It was made before the armies assembled, before the conch shells sounded, before Arjuna looked across the field and saw his teachers and his cousins and his grandfather standing in the opposing ranks, and felt his bow slip from his fingers. It was made in the quiet negotiations that preceded the war, in the conversations and the diplomatic missions and the increasingly desperate attempts to find a path that did not end in the destruction of everything. When Krishna went to Hastinapura as a peace ambassador for the Pandavas and sat in Duryodhan's court, and offered terms so reasonable that accepting them would have required nothing more than decency, Duryodhan refused. He refused with the comprehensive arrogance of someone who has convinced himself that his strength makes his cause righteous, simply by virtue of its magnitude. And in that refusal, the last possibility of peace closed. Krishna returned to the Pandav camp carrying the knowledge that the war was now inevitable, and he made his announcement: he would participate, but he would not fight. He would be available to one side and one side only, not his army, which Duryodhan had already claimed, but himself, unarmed, as a charioteer and a counselor. He stated this openly, without qualification. He would hold no weapon. He would strike no blow. Whatever happened on the field of Kurukshetra, he would witness it and guide it and endure it without personally entering the violence. The Mahabharata records this vow with the solemnity it deserves, because the tradition understood that what Krishna was promising was not merely a military posture, but a philosophical position, the declaration that there is a form of engagement with the world's conflicts that operates at a level above the exchange of force, and that this form of engagement is, in the deepest sense, the most powerful one available. Chapter 2: The morning Arjuna's bow fell. On the first day of the war, before a single arrow had been loosed, the Pandavas' greatest warrior had a crisis that threatened to end the war before it started, not from enemy action, but from the inside of his own chest. Arjuna asked Krishna to drive his chariot to the center of the field, between the two armies, so he could see who he was fighting. It was a reasonable military request. What he saw when he got there was not an abstraction. He saw Bhishma, who had bounced him on his knee as a child, and taught him the first principles of warrior conduct. He saw Drona, who had taken him as a student when he had nothing, and turned him into the finest archer in the world. He saw cousins he had grown up with, uncles he had respected, teachers whose knowledge lived in the very muscles of his arms every time he drew a bow. He saw all of this, and he understood, perhaps for the first time with the full weight of physical reality rather than strategic calculation, what the war meant. It meant killing these specific people, not an army in the abstract, but these faces, these names, these relationships. His bow slipped from his hands. He sunk into his chariot. He told Krishna that he would not fight, that no kingdom, no justice, no restoration of what had been stolen was worth the price of killing the people he loved. And Krishna, seated at the front of the chariot with the reins in his hands, turned to look at his friend. What followed was the Bhagavad Gita, 700 verses, 18 chapters, the most concentrated expression of spiritual philosophy in the history of human civilization, delivered in the space between two armies on a battlefield, by a man who had promised not to fight, to a man who had decided he could not. The irony is precise and clearly intentional. The greatest warrior of the age was paralyzed by love, and the being who would not lift a weapon was the only one who could restore him to action. Chapter 3. The teaching that was worth more than 10,000 soldiers. The Bhagavad Gita is not a pep talk. This is the misreading that reduces it to something smaller than it is, the idea that Krishna spent 18 chapters convincing a reluctant soldier to go back to fighting by appealing to his warrior pride or his sense of duty in the most straightforward sense. What Krishna actually did in those verses, on that field, with the armies standing at attention on both sides waiting for the conch shells to sound, was something considerably more radical. He gave Arjuna a framework for understanding the nature of the self, the nature of action, the nature of duty, the nature of time, the nature of the divine, and the relationship between all of these things. He gave Arjuna a framework so complete and so coherent that it transformed not just Arjuna's willingness to fight on that particular morning, but his understanding of what he was, what the war was, and what the purpose of any human action ever is. He told him that the self cannot be killed, that the beings he feared to destroy would not be destroyed by his arrows, because what is essential in a person is not the body that an arrow can pierce. He told him about karma yoga, action performed without attachment to its fruits, action taken because it is correct rather than because of what it will produce for the actor. He told him about the nature of the universe itself, the Vishvarupa, the cosmic form that Arjuna would briefly be granted the divine sight to see, the form that contains all beings and all events and all time simultaneously, in which the war and its outcome already exist, and Arjuna's arrows are simply the instrument through which what is already determined will become visible in the world of appearances. This teaching, delivered by a man who had sworn not to fight, from the front of a chariot, without weapons, did more to determine the outcome of the Kurukshetra war than any army could have accomplished. It gave Arjuna back to himself. And Arjuna, restored, was more dangerous than anything Duryodhana had calculated for. Chapter 4. The night Krishna almost broke his word. The vow was tested. The Mahabharata is not a text that resolves its tensions neatly, and the tradition preserves, with great care, the moment on the 9th day of the war when Krishna came as close as he ever came to abandoning his promise. Bhishma was the commander of the Kaurava forces, and Bhishma was a problem of cosmic proportions. He was not simply old and experienced, he was the son of the Ganga, virtually immortal, fighting with weapons and techniques that belonged to a tradition of warfare so ancient that most of the warriors on the field had never encountered them. He was devastating the Pandava army with systematic efficiency, and Arjuna, whether from the residual grief of fighting his grandfather, or from something else the texts are less certain about, was not shooting at him with the force the situation required. The Pandava forces were being destroyed. The war, on the 9th evening, was genuinely in question. And Krishna, watching from the chariot's seat, made his decision. He jumped down. He picked up a chariot wheel from the battlefield, a wheel torn loose in the fighting, lying in the dust, and he walked toward Bhishma with it raised above his head. The image the Mahabharata preserves here is extraordinary in its human scale, the god of the universe, walking across a battlefield with a chariot wheel, abandoning the most consequential vow he had ever made because the person he loved was in danger and the world he was trying to protect was failing. He was going to break his promise. He was going to fight. And then Arjuna caught him. Arjuna ran to his side, took his arm, held him, this man who could have leveled the battlefield with a thought, and begged him to return. He told Krishna that he would fight as he was supposed to fight, that Bhishma would be answered with arrows rather than with divine force. He made his own promise, there in the dust of the 9th evening of the war, to be what the war required of him. And Krishna, looking at his friend, let go of the chariot wheel. He walked back to his position. He held his vow. But the moment was recorded. The tradition preserved it precisely because it shows something about Krishna that pure divinity cannot show, the cost of the promise. The keeping of his word was not effortless. It was chosen, again and again, across 18 days, against the pull of love and urgency and the devastating clarity of someone who knew exactly what he could do if he simply stopped restraining himself. That is not weakness wearing the mask of principle. That is principle at its most absolute and most human simultaneously. Chapter 5, the Sudarshana Chakra and the Promise of the Wheel. There is a second moment, preserved most completely in the devotional literature and in certain regional Puranic traditions that surround the Mahabharata, when Krishna's vow was strained to the point where the Sudarshana Chakra itself began to move. The Sudarshana Chakra was Krishna's divine discus, the weapon that spun on his finger with the compressed energy of cosmic dissolution, the weapon that could and had reduced entire armies to nothing in previous ages. It was not a weapon you used cautiously. It was not something you reached for when you wanted to resolve a situation. It was something you reached for when you wanted to end one. On the 16th day of the war, Karna and Arjuna faced each other in the encounter that the entire war had been building toward. The confrontation between the two greatest archers of the age, one fighting for the Pandavas and one for the Kauravas, one the acknowledged hero of the world and one the fighter who had been denied that acknowledgement his entire life, and had spent every year of the denial becoming more dangerous because of it. The battle was fierce beyond anything that had happened on the field before, and in the intensity of it, Arjuna's position became critically endangered. Across the chariot, Krishna felt the Sudarshana Chakra begin to spin, not because he commanded it, but because it was his, and it responded to the threat to the person he was protecting with the autonomous fury of a divine weapon that does not distinguish between a command and an intention. It rose from his finger. It filled with light. And Krishna closed his eyes and stilled his intention and called it back. He held his vow one more time, in one more moment, when the easiest thing, the thing that every instinct and every capability he possessed was oriented toward, would have been to release it and let it do what it was made to do. He did not. He found another way. He always found another way. Because the vow was not simply a promise he had made to Duryodhan before the war as a condition of participation. It was a demonstration of the principle he had been teaching Arjuna since the first morning on the field, that action taken from complete understanding, with full awareness of its consequences and full acceptance of its cost, is categorically different from action taken from reaction, from fear, from the unexamined impulse to use available power, because the power is there and the need seems real. Chapter 6: The strategy that moved through other hands. What Krishna accomplished without fighting is one of the most carefully analyzed strategic records in the entire epic tradition, because the Mahabharata is a text that pays close attention to causality, to the chain of decisions and conversations and arrangements that connect a moment of action to the intention that produced it. And when you trace the critical turning points of the Kurukshetra war backward to their origin, an extraordinary pattern emerges. Most of them lead back to Krishna's counsel, delivered quietly, away from the battlefield, to the person who would act on it. The death of Bhishma was made possible by the strategy of placing Shikhandi, the reborn Amba, whose history with Bhishma made her presence on the field a condition under which Bhishma would not raise his bow directly before him. This arrangement did not happen by accident. The death of Drona was precipitated by the announcement that his son Ashwatthama was dead, an announcement that required Yudhishthir, the most truthful man in the world, to deliver a half-truth that he would carry for the rest of his life. The timing of that announcement, the management of Drona's access to information, the positioning of the moment, all of this required coordination that had a single organizing intelligence behind it. The breaking of Karna's divine protections, the loss of his armor at Indra's hands, the exhaustion of his Brahmastra, the curse that made his chariot wheel sink into the earth at the critical moment, all of these had been set in motion across years, through conversations and arrangements that Krishna had either facilitated or simply been aware of, in the way that a being who can see the shape of time is aware of what is coming. He fought with foresight. He fought with strategy. He fought with counsel and with timing and with the precise placement of the right word in the right ear at the right moment. And the war was won not on the days when the strongest fighters struck the hardest blows, but on the days when the right decision was made by the right person, because the right voice was whispering in the right ear. Chapter 7: What the vow was really saying. The deeper philosophical meaning of Krishna's decision not to fight is something the Bhagavata tradition has been unpacking for 4,000 years, and it is worth unpacking carefully here, because it is the layer of the story that makes everything else in it fully coherent. Krishna was not absent from the Kurukshetra war. He was more present in it than any fighter on either side. He was present in every choice Arjuna made, because Arjuna had heard the Gita and was making his choices from inside a framework that Krishna had given him. He was present in every strategic decision the Pandavas took, because his counsel had shaped the thinking that produced those decisions. He was present in the outcome, because the outcome was not the product of who hit hardest, but of who understood most clearly what the war was for and why the right side had to win it. What the vow was saying, at its deepest level, was this: the most important thing I can do in this war is not add my strength to the Pandav's strength. The most important thing I can do is ensure that the Pandavas understand why they are fighting, what they are fighting for, and who they must be in order to be worthy of winning. Because a war won by the right side for the wrong reasons, with the wrong understanding, producing warriors who believed that their victory was the product of their own power, that war produces a world that is only marginally better than the one it replaced. But a war won by people who understand the nature of dharma, who have faced the full cost of righteous action and chosen it anyway, who have been broken open by grief and restored by wisdom and made larger by the experience of their own limitation, that war produces something that can actually hold. Krishna understood that the Pandavas did not need his sword arm. They needed his mind, his counsel, his teaching, and his willingness to be present to their suffering without resolving it prematurely by simply overwhelming it with divine force. He gave them all of this, at the cost of watching, for 18 days, the people he loved bleed and fall and struggle, when he could have ended it any morning with one released chakra. The restraint was not passivity. It was the most active, most demanding, most completely engaged form of participation he could have offered. Chapter 8: The Legacy of the Unarmed God. When the Kurukshetra war ended and the Pandavas stood in the smoking ruins of everything the world had been, the accounting of what had happened was painful in its totality. Almost everyone was dead. 18 Akshohinis of warriors, numbers so large the mind resists them, had been reduced to a handful of survivors over 18 days. The Kaurava side was gone. The Pandav side had survived, barely, at a cost that made victory feel, in those first days, indistinguishable from defeat. And in the middle of this accounting, a question arose that the tradition has been sitting with ever since: if Krishna was who he was, if his power was what every text says it was, why did any of this have to happen at all? Why 18 days and this mountain of the dead when one morning's action could have resolved it? The answer the Mahabharata offers is the answer embedded in everything Krishna did and said from the moment he sat down on Arjuna's chariot, because the war was not primarily about who won. It was about what the winning cost, what it required of the people who were fighting for the right side, what it made of them in the process of making them victorious. If Krishna had fought, if he had ended it in an afternoon with the Sudarshana Chakra spinning and the Narayani Sena at full strength, the Pandavas would have returned to their kingdom as men who had been rescued. Men who had witnessed power save them. Men who knew, in the deepest chamber of their self-understanding, that they had not been sufficient to their own cause without divine intervention. That knowledge would have hollowed out everything they built afterward. Instead, they returned as men who had faced the hardest thing imaginable, killing those they loved in the name of what was right, and had done it with their own hands and their own bows and their own breaking hearts, guided by wisdom that taught them why it had to be done but never did it for them. They returned as men who had become equal to what was required of them. And that is what Krishna, sitting unarmed on a chariot for 18 days, had always been building toward. Not their victory, their becoming. The vow not to fight was never about Krishna's restraint. It was about what Arjuna and Bhima and Yudhishthir and all the rest of them needed to grow into in order to be capable of inhabiting the world that the war was clearing space for. He gave them something no weapon could have given them, the experience of finding, inside themselves, everything the moment required. And that gift, unlike any victory won by force, could never be taken away. He could have ended the war in an afternoon. He chose instead to sit on a chariot for 18 days, hold the reins, and give the people he loved the chance to become everything they needed to be. That is not restraint. That is the most profound act of faith in the potential of human beings that the ancient world ever recorded. If that idea landed in you today, if this story showed you something about power and wisdom and the difference between what you can do and what you should do, then do not keep it to yourself. Hit that like button right now and put this story in front of everyone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who is facing a battle of their own, someone who is wondering whether the right kind of help looks like force or like a voice in their ear reminding them of who they are. And subscribe, because every week on this channel we return to the great library of stories that this civilization built, and we bring back something that was always meant for today. Krishna sat unarmed and changed everything. We tell these stories unarmed, with nothing but words and the conviction that the right story, told at the right moment, is the most powerful thing in the world. We will see you in the next one. See you until next time. Thank you.